In this lesson, we will be looking at condition statements in C#. By now, I'm sure we all have the hang of creating new projects. So I have already created a new project and I'm calling this one condition statements. And I already cleaned out the main function to put in some comments. So you can pause the video here, go ahead and create your new project inside your solution. And once again, it is called condition statements. Now, a little prelude before I get into what condition statements really mean. I want us to examine something about programming in general. Most, if not all, well, every programming language has three control structures. They are sequence, decisions, or selection, and repetition. Sequence basically refers to the fact that the program is going to execute the commands in the exact order that you placed them. So in previous examples where we printed a prompt and then we waited for input and then we prompted again, notice that it went in the exact sequence that we wrote it. So that is sequence. However, when we get to a roadblock and we need to maybe make a decision to say if something meets a certain criteria, then take this action or take another action, then that is another control structure called selection or decisions. Now, in this lesson, we'll be exploring two condition statements that help us to make selections. They are if statements and switch statements, and then we're going to look at ternary statements as a bonus. Now let's get started looking at if statements. A typical reason why we would need to use an if statement is to determine something or some action based on some condition. So let us say that I wanted to print something to the screen if something was the way that I think it may or may not be, right? So let us say I wanted to say if, and I'm going to keep it very simple, and I'm going to say something like if 2 is less than 3. So notice this is a new operator. We did arithmetic operators earlier. Now we'll have the comparison operators where we're comparing is 2 greater than or less than, this is less than 3. All right, so 2 is less than 3. If 2 is less than 3, then I want to do something. Please note the syntax behind this statement. The keyword is if, then I open parenthesis, then I place the condition inside of the open parenthesis, and then I close. So inside of the parentheses, I should have a condition. Is something maybe equivalent to something? Is it less than? Is it greater than? There's so many ways we can compare things, but I'm just checking if 2 is less than 3, then I want to print something to the screen. So I can say console dot write line, and I'm going to say, yes, it is. All right. So then I can say if 2 is less than 3, then print, yes, it is. What if there was another condition, or if that wasn't the condition, then I wanted to take another action. So if it is, then print, yes, it is. And then I can say else. And then after else, I need my curly braces again. And then I'm going to say, what would I do if this condition is not met? So I'm going to take this console.write line and duplicate it just to expedite this. And I'm going to say, no, it is not. So once again, I'm saying if 2 is less than 3, then print, yes, it is. Else print, no, it's not. Now you notice that this line kind of looks a bit grayed out or kind of dull, and Visual Studio is basically just telling me that based on the condition that I specified here, I would never ever get to the else, which is true because every time I'm going to run that, unless I change these values, 2 will always be less than 3. So yes, it is will always get printed. The else would never get printed, but I'm still going to leave the else because then I'm going to show you different conditions that can go in here and how the code would be executed. So let's execute this and see the end result. So once again, it's going to run in the sequence and it's going to say, if 2 is less than 3, what should I do? So let's check that out. So remember that you can change your startup project using this drop-down list. Just make sure that it's on condition statements and go ahead and click start. And the end result is that it prints, yes, it is. And that's because the condition was true. Now, if I change these values to something that, well, I want to say, no, it's not, then I can say, is 10 less than maybe 3. All right, I'll leave the 3. So if 10 is less than 3, then we want to print yes, it is. Else, print no, it's not. Now, just looking at it, we know that 10 is not less than 3. So we expect that this condition will not evaluate to true. Thus, it won't do what is in the first block, but it will do what's in the else block. So else is basically the false for any condition that is outlined inside of the if. So let's try that again. I'm going to run the program, and the expectation is that it will say, no, it's not, because 10 is not less than 3. And there we go. No, it's not. All right, so that's a very, very simple example. Let's put a bit more meat on it. So I'm going to define some variables. I'm going to define num1 and num2. So int num1. And please note, with variables, I may not have mentioned this before, but when you're using variables or when you're declaring variables, you want to avoid spaces in the names and you want to avoid special characters. Almost the same rules as when I suggested how you name your projects. You can camel case the names if you have multiple words. Some people use underscores, but ultimately just avoid any space and any special character. All right, so num1 is going to be equal to 2 and num2 is equal to 5. And see, in doing that, I violated my own rules, and Visual Studio is telling me that I'm wrong. So int num2 is equal to 5. And before I use these two variables in the example, I just want to take this time to list out the other comparison operators that you have to your advantage. So you have, and I'm just putting the brace there so you can see them. So you have the less than, you have greater than, you have equivalence. So notice two equal signs. So the equal sign by itself is an assignment operator where you're assigning a value from the right to the variable on the left. However, if you want to compare if two things are equal to each other, then you have the equal. All right, so that's the distinction between a single equal sign and a double equal sign. So we have equal, we have hybrid ones like greater than and equal, or less than and equal. And then you have one that says not equal, which is an exclamation sign and an equal sign. All right, so those are operators that you can use inside of your if statements when you want to compare the value on the left with the value on the right. Okay, so now we have num1 and num2. We did this with static values, but we can also write an if statement with variables. All right, so I could be comparing num1 with the number 3. So I can say if num1 is less than 3, then I want to take this action. Otherwise, I want to take that action. All right. So in this situation, I have num1 declared to have a value of 2. So if I execute this, then 2 is going to be less than 3. However, if I said num5 here, based on the value of num5, then num2, num2 has the value of 5, my bad. So if I say num2 is less than 3, as long as num2 retains the value of 5, then we'll know that it is not less than 3, and so it will go to the else block and print, no, it's not. So you can use variables to compare with static values, and you can also compare two variables, num1 and num2. All right, so here's what I'm going to do. We're going to write a full program where we're accepting data from a user, and then we'll run an if statement to know what to print out based on the input from the user. So I'm going to write a program that's going to ask our users to tell us how many apples they have and how many oranges they have. So I'm going to console.write the first prompt to say, how many apples do you have? And then we'll do a console.readline where we get the input, but then of course we can't just console.readline. This value needs to go into a variable. So I'm going to use num1 to store the number of apples. So num1 is equal to console.readline. And then we know that num1 is an integer. So if we're putting something into the integer from the console input, we need to convert it. So I'm going to say convert dot to int 32 and then open parenthesis. and close parenthesis around that. And then I'm just going to copy this line instead of retyping it from scratch. And then I'm going to say, how many oranges do you have? And we're storing oranges in num2. So now I have user input for num1 and user input for num2, which of course will override the values that they were initialized with, because I'm not going to trouble the initialization here, or at least I would always recommend that if you're initializing, you always initialize to a safe enough value that, you know, it doesn't tamper with your operation going forward. So we're initializing num1 to 0 and num2 to 0, and then we're prompting for the number of apples and storing that in num1, and then I'm prompting for the number of oranges and storing that in num2. Now my if statement is saying if num2 is less than num1, then I want to take a particular action. But then I feel probably more comfortable saying if num2 is greater than num1. It really doesn't matter. So based on your context and based on how you probably would want to, if you can say it in English or say it to yourself, how would I compare these two? Then you can just translate it into code using the appropriate operator. All right. So I'm going to say if num1 is greater than num2, then that means that I would have more oranges. So num2 represents oranges. So if num2 is greater than num1, then I have more oranges than I have apples. So then my console line is going to be, you have more oranges. And then if that is false, meaning num2 is not greater than num1, then I'm going to print, you have more apples. Now let's do a quick test and see the outcome of that. So how many apples do you have? I'm going to say I have 2 apples and I have 5 oranges. So the expectation is that it prints, you have more oranges. All right, let's do another test where I flip the script. This time I have 10 apples and I have 5 oranges. And so when that evaluates in my if statement, I should be getting, you have more apples. And there we go. So that's basically what a selection does. It looks at a condition and then it makes a decision based on the outcome, whether it's true or false for that condition. Now, the if statement can be expanded a bit more, and I'm just going to do this and then we leave if statements for now because if statements are very useful. And as we go along, we will be using them and seeing more purposes, but I just want us to have an appreciation for how they work and why we will be needing them going forward. But the if statement can also have more than one or more than 2 blocks. So right now we're just looking at if, condition, and then else. But then you do have the facility to have multiple conditions in one big if statement. So I can say if num2 is greater than num1, then print, you have more oranges. Then I can say else if, and then state another condition. So I'm going to say if num1 is greater than num2, num1 being apples, and num2 being oranges. So first I'm checking, do I have more oranges than apples? Then I can say otherwise, if there are more apples than oranges, then I want to print, you have more apples. What if I wanted to add on another statement, another condition, and I said else if, and then state another condition. And then for that part, I would want to say if they are equivalent. So I can say if num1 is equivalent to num2, then open brace, console.writeLine, and then I'm going to say you have apples, or let me say the same, you have the same number of apples and oranges. Now we have one if statement doing 3 different conditions. All right, so I have if num2 is greater than num1, then print something. Else if num1 is greater than num2, then print something. Else if num1 is equivalent to num2. So there are plenty of ways we could have written this, but then, I mean, there are so many ways to write it. I can never show you every single scenario. Once you appreciate the concept, then you can be more flexible. So in this situation, once again, I'm just checking if num2 is greater than num1, then I want to print you have more oranges. And then if that doesn't evaluate to true, then it moves on to the next statement to say, console.writeLine, you have more apples, right? And if that evaluates the false, then it moves on to the next condition where it says, okay, if they're equivalent, then print this statement. Now, there are situations where none of these would ever match, and then that's why you have the else. So the else is like the catch-all, all right? So if we have an else, you usually use that to say, well, when every other condition fails, then take some action. And this is, once again, is a catch-all. So I'm going to say final action, or, well, invalid parameters. Now, based on this example, I don't know what I could possibly put in that none of these would get met. And further to that, the comparison for greater than and equal to and less than and equal to would not fit into the scenario. And, well, we always expect it. If one of these would be met, then clearly they're not equal, right? But then the case study, or the use cases for these rather, would be like if you're comparing grades, right? So if the grades start at, maybe an A starts at 90, then you can say if you have a grade that is greater than or equal to 90, then you have an A. If the failing grade is 59, then you can say if you have a grade that is less than or equal to 59, then you are a failing student. So you could have done the greater than and equal to for that A, or I could have just said if your grade is greater than 89, because then we know that anything greater than 89 is probably 90. But then based on the scenario, once again, you may or may not need to use it, or you can use multiple to accomplish the same thing. Anyhow, let's run a test on this. So I'm going to put in some scenarios where I'm going to put in some values, and then we should put in values that will invoke each statement as we go along. Once again, the else statement may never get called because one of these conditions will be met anyway. So let's try it out. So firstly, we want a bigger number for num2 than for num1. So we want more oranges than apples. So I have 5 apples, and then I have 10 oranges. So num2 is greater than num1, so you have more oranges. All right, let me run this program again. This time I have more apples than oranges. So I have 10 apples and I only have 5 oranges. Then it says you have more apples. So this condition for num1 being greater than num2 being greater than num1 failed. So it went on to the else if, and then this condition was met. So it printed that statement. Now, if I have the same number between the two fruit types, so that means I have 10 oranges and 10 apples. When I press enter, then it went to the else if they are equivalent, then you have the same number of apples and oranges. All right. So there are some rules surrounding how if statements should look. Notice the special tokens that I've been using along the way, the keywords if, and then the parentheses, and then the condition inside the parentheses, and then notice no semicolon at the end of this line. And then I open the curly brace, and then the C# syntax as we've come to know it with all the console write, console read line, whatever it is that we're doing, those can proceed, but then only between the braces. So I can't put any code in this line. I can't be console.writeLine in between the if block, just like that, right? That is illegal. So whatever operation it is you need to carry out, and notice I have that red line. So it's saying that it's expecting, it's incorrect syntax. It probably won't tell you details about the incorrect syntax, but just follow these rules and you should feel comfortable when writing if statements. So once again, you have a condition, you have an if statement, you create the condition inside of the parentheses, and then you open the curly brace, and then you proceed to write all your code inside of your curly braces. Whatever you write inside of the curly braces is what gets done when that particular condition is met. So if num2 is greater than num1, then I want to take this set of actions. Else if this other condition is met, meaning this one failed, but then this one gets met, then I want to carry out these actions. And then I have another else if this condition is met, then I have my specific actions. And then my else is the catch-all, meaning that none of these came to pass. None of them matched my requirements. So the else would be like the catch-all. So, based on the situation, then it may be good, it may not be bad. So in this situation, if it ever got to the else, I know that that's bad because that's not what I expect. However, in our first example, you saw that I only had if condition and then else. So when it's a simple condition where it's either or, it's either this condition is true or it's not true, then you can just use an if else. If you have 5 different scenarios that you need to test, or in this case, 3 different scenarios you need to test, then you can write if, else if. And if you know that they're the only 3, then you really don't even need the else. So it can work without the else in this scenario. Now, like I said, this is an introduction, so we're just scratching the surface with if statements, but I'm going to move on to switch statements, which help us to make selections, but just do it a bit differently. So the if statement gives us the ability to make more complex decisions, right? We can say if something is greater than, we can compare 2 values or some variable to some other value, whatever it is we're comparing, and then make an action. The switch statement, however, we have to look at a variable and then make a decision based on just the value of the variable. So I'm going to give you an example. So the switch statements look something like switch, and then it takes a variable inside of the parentheses. So what I'm going to do is define another variable, and I'm going to call this one num3. So int num3, and it's going to be equal to 0. All right. So I'm going to say switch num3, which means assess the value inside of num3. Then I'm going to say case, and then I can give a value. So case 1, then colon. So please note the syntax, because this is very important that you follow the syntax properly. So you say switch, open brace or open parentheses, put a variable in there, and then you open your curly brace, and then you make a case. So you say case, then the value that you want to assess this variable for. So I'm saying if the value of num3 is 1, then I say colon, and what comes after the colon is the action I intend to take. So then I'm going to say console dot writeLine, and let's keep it simple and just say value is 1. All right. And then after I say that, then I need a keyword, so I can list as many actions underneath this. So what comes after the case will be just like what comes inside the curly braces for the if statement. But then I have to end the case with a keyword that says break. All right. So I can say case 1, console writeLine, value is 1. So I'm just going to copy this so I can retype it. Then what if I wanted to do something else if the value was 2? So I have case 2, colon, then I state my action. So I'm going to console the writeLine, and I'm going to change it from value is 1 and say something like I have 2 now. All right. So I have 2 now. If the value is 2, it will print I have 2 now to the screen. And then once again, I can print as many things as I want or take as many other actions as I need to. So I'm going to print this 3 times or 3 more times. So, and this is just for example, I'm just showing you that you can have multiple lines coming after the case and the value and the colon. And then when you're done, you just make sure you put your keyword that says break. If you don't put the break keyword, and let's say I forgot the break keyword, then what would happen is that it would just run on. So you can have as many cases as you feel the need for, right? So as many situations or cases that you think or values that you want to compare this variable against, you can have case and whatever that value. Since we're using integer, we just put the value as integer. If this was a string, then I would be saying case and then putting in the string, all right? But then we have to keep it type sensitive. So if it's an integer variable that we're assessing, then the case value must be an integer. If it's a double, then, well, it has to be numeric if it's integer or double. If it's a string, then it must be a string. But then otherwise, we have, similar to the else in the if statement, we have a default situation that says, well, if none of the cases match, then I am going to do something. So I'm going to, inside of the default, just console writeLine and say invalid value. All right. So I'm only comparing for 1 and 2, which means that if if num3 is never 1 and num3 is never 2, then I want the default to come into play and say invalid value. And then once again, I break. Once I've done that, everything is inside of that curly brace. So I'm just going to put in a prompt for num3 at the same time. So after we deal with our apples and oranges, I'm going to say, how many eyes do you have? That's a good one, that right? It's either have 1 eye or 2 eyes, but then I'm just going to say invalid value if you put any other number that's not 1 or 2, right? So how many eyes do you have? And then I'm going to console the read line, into num3. So let's test that one out. So I don't want to have to do all of this again, so I'm just going to comment out my if statement. So the shortcut to comment is Control, K, and C, right? So holding down, after highlighting the lines, I just held on Control, press K, press C, and then all of those lines that were highlighted got commented. So now when I execute, my program is going to ignore the commented lines and just go straight to asking me how many eyes do I have, and then taking an action based on our value. So I have 1 eye. Then I'm going to say value is 1. All right. Maybe I can make it a bit more intuitive. So I'm going to change it and say you have 1 eye. All right. This is just for educational purposes. It's not really necessary. So if you don't feel like changing it, then that's fine. But you have 1 eye. And then I'm going to try it again. And then I'm going to put in the value 2. So with 2, we expect to have 4 statements being printed, and I have 2 now is printed 4 times. So once again, you can have as many lines as required underneath the case. So in between the case definition and the keyword break, everything in there will get executed. So let's do another one, and we will put in the value of 3. So 3, since there's no case defined for a value of 3, we'll go to the default and tell us invalid value. So that's basically how switch statements work. A good use case for a switch statement would be like in a menu setting where you're expecting certain values. So if you say like press 1 to enter grade, press 2 to view grade, press 3 to exit program, then you could just say get the user's input into the variable, and then you run a switch against that value, and then based on which case was chosen or which value was selected, you run a case for that, you take the actions accordingly, and then if they enter a menu option of 5 when you only have 3 menu options, then you have the default. All right. Now, as a bonus, I'm going to show you ternary statements, and I left this one for last because this one can be a bit difficult to grasp. And there are ways around using it, but it can be a bit difficult, but it's very, very convenient once you understand how it works. So I'm going to define another variable, and I'm going to call this one result. So this one is going to be string, and I'm calling this result. All right. Now, the purpose of the ternary operator is to run a quick comparison, and it allows you to decide right there on the spot what value to assign to a variable when that condition is met or not met. So in other words, with our if statement, if I said num2 greater than num1, I could have done an assignment to a variable in here, but then I would have to say num2 is equal to num1 greater than num2, and then do another assignment here, and then on this one I have to do another assignment. Whereas in a ternary operator, I can say result is equal to, and then what I want to compare is num2 being greater than num1. All right, so this is my condition. And then I can use a colon. And then I say, and I think usually this needs to go inside parentheses. So let's just put it in parentheses. So then I say, this is my condition, and then question mark. And then I'm going to say num2 greater than num1. Then I'm going to say, what did we assign? More oranges. You have more oranges when that is. So you have more oranges, and then colon, and then we're going to say you have more apples. All right. So let me just start over. A lot just happened. So we have a variable, and then I'm saying what the contents of this variable depend on the outcome of this comparison. So my variable result is going to be assigned some value based on the result of this comparison, which is saying, is num2 greater than num1? Then I have the question mark to say, if this is true, so all of this is saying, if this comparison is true, then I'm assigning that value to be inside of result. And then the colon says, otherwise, it is this value. So the good thing about this is that in one line, I just ran a mini if-else statement. All right. The downside is that that's all it can do. I can't have a third scenario to say if the greater than or their equivalent. Sorry, I can't have a third scenario. So I just run one condition and then I say based on the outcome, if it's true, then I want the first one to be done. If it's false, then I want the last one to be done. Now, once again, this comes in handy a lot of the times, but the if statements are very easy to do. Switch statements are very quick also. But then this, if you understand the concept, you can use this at any point and expedite completing your program that you are authoring. So I'm going to leave this program. I'm going to uncomment all of these lines so that if you get your hands on the source code, then you will have all of these examples for you. And to uncomment, that's Control-KU. So let me just show you that. So if I am on a line and I want to comment it, I can just say Control-KC and then it comments it. And then if I want to uncomment it, I can just say Control-KU. And there you go. So you press K and U or K and C while holding down Control. All right. So that's it for condition statements. That's a brush over. I hope you understand the concepts. If you don't, feel free to reach out to me. But as we go along, we're going to be using them more and more. So you will get to appreciate real scenarios where you will need to make selections and decisions based on values that are coming into your system.